Hey, Avi, how are you? We're live.
Hi, Alicia. Good to talk to you again. And so happy to be here.
Good to, I'm so happy that you're here and that we're able to continue this conversation on designing healthy environments and discuss the work that you're doing. Specifically today, we're going to talk about, embodied carbon emission and healthy environments with materials, equity, and justice, with a focus on interiors. As you know, we can go in so many directions, but today it's about interiors and hearing about the work that you are doing. So welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so today, for all of you who are listening, thank you for joining. My name is Alicia Ponce. I'm the founder and principal of AP Monarch. We are a Chicago-based, women-owned architecture firm in Chicago. And today we are joined by Avi Rajagopal, but he's editor-in-chief of Metropolis Magazine. If you're not following what this man is doing, or Metropolis Magazine, what they're doing, please do so now, because it is a ton of, a wealth of information on design and architecture and interiors. And we are just going to hit upon a little bit of the major things that they are doing, right, Avi?
Absolutely. And happy to do that.
Yeah, so we're going to dive right in. And today's talk has a focus on healthy materials, equity, and justice. And we're going to go right into healthy materials, embodied carbon emissions over the life cycle of interior projects. The season 3 of Designing Healthy is really about time is of the essence. And with interiors, we now know that we can make a much bigger and faster impact in the built environment with respect to climate change. So Avi, what is your role right now with respect to interiors and a healthy environment?
So that's exactly right, Alicia. It's exactly what you said. I feel like the architecture and interior design industry, the AEC industry in general, maybe has not focused as much on interiors as a place to fight climate change, because of course, like when you look at the carbon emissions associated with buildings, first of all, operational carbon is a big part of the puzzle. So, the energy that buildings actually use, that's a huge piece of the pie, okay? And we get that, like we have to work on reducing that. And then when we look at embodied carbon, which is really the emissions associated with making buildings, right? Making and maintaining buildings. Within that, we've traditionally focused on concrete and steel and glass, things that are associated with the envelope and structure of a building. We haven't focused as much on interiors so far, or at least until a few years ago, because when you build a building, right, when you build a new building, and if you do a carbon assessment, a life cycle assessment of the building, you will see generally that your numbers for concrete and steel and glass are huge, right? They're like 40% of your carbon footprint is tied up there as far as embodied carbon goes. And when you look at interiors finishes, we're talking about flooring, tiles, ceilings, furniture, lighting, textile, stuff like that. It usually looks like 7%, 9%, like it looks like a smaller percentage, right? But the problem is that once you've built the building, that concrete and steel is not going anywhere. So that 40%, whether the building is a year old, 10 years old, or 40 years old, or 100 years old, that percentage does not change over the life of the building. But with interiors, it's different because interiors get renovated. And we know, home renovations during COVID-19 were, at an all-time high in the
Oh,
US.
yeah.
Offices are renovated every 5 years or so. Hotels are renovated all the time. Usually big hotel chains have a standard practice of when they refresh their interiors. Hospitals, most facility managers in healthcare facilities want to change out the finishes every 10 years or so because they need to continue to function to keep people safe. So there's lots of good reasons why we renovate interiors, but we do it often. So if you think about that 7% at the start when a building is built, when you calculate 10 years in, you've probably added another 7% to that, whereas your concrete and steel has remained the same, right? When you're looking at 50 years after the building is built, now you've had that many more renovation cycles, right? And every time an interior is renovated, we're taking all the stuff out, we're generally taking it to landfill, and we're bringing new stuff in. So that's carbon emissions for taking stuff out, carbon emissions for bringing stuff in, right? And so the carbon emissions of interiors, really, you have to understand time in a different way. And so that really fits in with your theme for this season. Time really is of the essence. And, we think like, okay, we need to focus on like steel and glass and concrete because those are the big materials. Whereas who cares about lamps and, chairs? But turns out those lamps and chairs and stuff over time, adds up. So there is a way for us to start to address the climate change through the choices of materials and products that we make in interiors. And, I'm sure we're going to talk about this more. One last thing I will say is, generally speaking, if you change the concrete mix in a building, right? Like you're using carbon pure concrete or you're using filler or carbon sequestering materials, it's great for the planet. Like we're doing really important things by doing that. But for the people who walk in and out of the building, they may not notice a big difference, right? Like if you're in a building that has a foundation made of old school, concrete versus carbon pure concrete, like doesn't make a big difference to your human experience and your personal sort of individual health seen in the short term. Whereas if you change out the flooring or furniture in a space, you immediately start to notice a difference, right? Like you choose one chair over another, it makes a difference in how you experience the space. So there is a way in which working on climate change within interiors has a direct connection to health and comfort, in a way that, maybe some other measures of bringing down carbon emissions don't. So interiors have this really unique opportunity of addressing carbon at the same time as when we address, as we address, health and well-being as well. And then I'm sure we'll come to the equity piece in a bit. That's a little bit more complicated, but I'll stop there. That's generally, I think, the work that we've been doing at Metropolis. We published an article about it at the end of 2020. We've been working on a number of advocacy initiatives. I'm happy to talk about that. We launched a resource, which is the Climate Toolkit for Interior Design last year. So we'll talk more, but in general, that's kind of where we've focused.
No, that's wonderful. And I just like to point out, I hope that you can hear me okay. There is a little time lapse on my end, but the information coming off of your end is really, really awesome. So thank you so much for sharing that. Let's talk a little bit about the supply chain transparency and the challenges and successes that you have seen so far.
So supply chain transparency is absolutely critical for working on climate, for working on health, and for working on equity. It is the one thing that we need in our industry for us to be able to make better decisions about how we design interiors. And I will say that there's been a huge movement and progress around supply chain transparency in our industry over the last few years. Product manufacturers have put a lot of effort into digging into their supply chains making information available through documents, specifically through what we call environmental product declarations, EPDs, or health product declarations, which are HPDs. Both of those documents are basically, if you are an interior designer and you want to understand transparency information, those two are sort of your gold standard. Like that's where you go for information. So on the one hand, product manufacturers have been doing a lot in terms of ensuring transparency. The second good thing that we've seen, and I'll come to the bad things in a minute, but the second good thing we've seen is the creation of sampling tools and databases, right? So we've seen really great tools come on board, which take that transparency information and make it useful to designers in order for them to make good product choices. So we're talking about things like Mindful Materials, which is an amazing database, which allows you to, look at some very key criteria that affects climate, health, and equity. We have, the EC3, which is particularly focused on embodied carbon and is hugely growing its interiors materials portfolio. So very soon, it offers really wonderful analytical ability in terms of comparing and benchmarking the embodied carbon of product choices that you're making in the interiors. There's lots of great tools like this that are slowly coming on board. And then we're seeing more, kind of general tools incorporating sustainability information. So, Ecomedes, another great database for products that, allows you to look at carbon emissions as part of that. Material Bank, which is a sampling service, and it's a sister company to Metropolis. They now have sustainability filters. So you can, kind of sort, even as you're sampling materials, you can sort out materials that have good outcomes for climate, health, and equity. So there's lots of good movement in supply chain transparency. Where we're running into some issues is that the methods of reporting are not standardized or consistent. And that's not the fault of I just want to say that's not the fault of manufacturers. It's not the fault of, whatever. It's just that different product categories have different criteria. So the way you look at embodied carbon or health or transparency or supply chain for a chair, an office chair can have 50 different components, 100 different components, right? Whereas a piece of carpet tile has 4, 5, 6 components, right? They're very different problems when it comes to transparency. And so that's kind of where we're stuck a little bit right now, is that different product categories are a little bit ahead or behind when it comes to supply chain transparency. I will say supply chains, one thing I want to remind everyone is that supply chains doesn't end once, the supply chain doesn't end once the building is shipped to your project site, right? On your project site, you have contractors and fabricators and installers and all kinds of people working with those materials to actually create the project. When you look at supply chains of buildings, you have to look at them end to end. So, that last piece should also be considered when we're looking at climate, health, and equity. Are we creating a healthy environment for the workers on our project sites? Also, as we know, every 10 years, every 5 years, whatever, that interior is going to be, as I said, you're typically, tearing down the interior, putting a new interior in space. Hopefully we'll change that practice, but until we change that practice, we also have to think about the safety and health of the people who are engaged in that activity. What about the people who live near the landfills where all that material is going? All of this stuff, when we pick a single product in an interior space, if we pay attention to the supply chain across the board, end to end, cradle to cradle, as they say, or cradle to grave, landfill in this case, whatever that cycle might be, we can actually make a huge impact on all three fronts, on climate, health, and equity. We can make a very big impact just by making, really informed choices on products. I'm not saying it's an easy thing. It's not an easy thing. There's lots of gaps of information. There's, in some cases, we don't have tools, in some cases, whatever. But this needs to be our effort, I think. If we are trying, how can we get there? So we have to start really paying attention to our product specification, not just from budget point of view, not just from a, aesthetics or project goals point of view, but also from a supply chain point of view.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, even though the discussion might be new or appear to be difficult, we're able to do that. We're definitely able to do that. And, great things don't come easy normally, right? We have to work at them. And the thing is that it's innovation as we speak, and there are tools out there that are being created. I mean, how long did it take for the HPDs and EPDs to come on live? And now, if you're a product manufacturer, this should really be a part of your practice, right? And so you've kind of already started to touch into our next topic of equity and how these labels like HPD, EPD, mindful materials, and material bank, they're out there now. But do they talk about equity? And I'm thinking about, like, how is water and air impacted for local communities when these materials are manufactured, right? Because it's also our responsibility as designers, as architects, and people like you who are sharing the message, is to, understand every step of the way, the life cycle. So I know that you guys are doing awesome things on equity and elevating that message and bringing. I'd love for you to share more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, equity is a tough topic to handle. Tough not because it's complicated. I mean, carbon was complicated till we created the tools for it. Health was complicated till we created the tools for it. It's not like it's tough because it's complicated. It's tough because we haven't been talking about it for long enough yet. Okay, we've kind of started to make progress, but there needs to be a lot more to be done. So I'll just preface it by saying that before we go any further on equity, I just want to point out that the framework I'm using, so you hear me talk about climate very often, like I'm talking about these three things: climate, health, equity. This comes from an effort that Metropolis was a part of last year, where Metropolis, the American Society of Interior Designers, the International Interior Designers Association, IIDA, and IDC, which is the Interior Designers of Canada, came together, with the blessings and involvement of lots of other people in the industry, came together to create what we call the Interior Design Pledge for Positive Impact. So it's the first time that it really articulates what does good or sustainable interior design mean. What do we mean when we say interior design should make a positive impact in the world? We haven't really articulated that before. We have done that now. And all the these are the three professional associations for interior design in this country, and all three of them agreed that this is the framework, right? And so the framework essentially looks at the three pillars that I keep mentioning: climate, health, and equity. But one of the things we talk about with that pledge for positive impact, which I urge everybody who's listening, if you're in any way connected to the interior design industry, I urge you to take the pledge. It's available on the Metropolis website, metropolismac.com/interiors-pledge. It's easy to find on our website. I urge you to take the pledge. When you take the pledge, you can tell us whether you're an ASID or IID or IDC member. But one of the important things that the pledge does is reminds us that these topics are interconnected. Okay, you can't take a carbon decision without thinking about health or equity. You can't take a health decision without thinking about carbon or equity. You can't take an equity decision without thinking about carbon and health. If we ignore any one of those pieces, we may end up causing inadvertently a negative impact where we're wanting to make a positive impact, right? So we have to think about all those three things together. And the good thing is that when it comes to equity, the conversation can get very complicated. Like, what is an equitable interior, right? You can think about that at many levels, and I completely get that, right? Like, so an equitable interior would be an interior maybe that's inclusive and accessible to all kinds of people. That is true. That is also part of equity in interiors. But we can't just think about the outcome of design without thinking about the process of design. And it's like saying we only care about operational carbon, but we don't care about embodied carbon, right? My building runs on low energy, but I polluted the environment while making the building. That's not okay. So my building is very wonderful for people of different abilities to come and use it. It's very supportive of neurodiverse people. It's great. It's great. It's very accessible. It goes beyond ADA measures. Yes, but I used exploitative labor to build it. Like, that's not an equitable interior, right? Like, and so
it's easy to look away,
it's
if
easy
you
to
don't
look
see it, then you just look away.
Absolutely. So it's easy for us to focus on the outcomes, like the end product of the interior design process, the actual interior space. Harder for us to look at the process that got us there. And so at Metropolis, we've been saying that just like we think about embodied carbon, we know that there's a certain amount of carbon emissions involved in making the interiors, not just in using the interiors. We also have to think about embodied justice, that there's a certain amount of equity or fairness involved in making the interior, not just in how the interior space is used, right? And so when you think about embodied justice, we did a feature article about it in our November-December issue 2021, available on our website now. It's definitely a concept that crosses over between interior design and architecture, of course, but we have to think about that. We have to think about is our interior affecting. Let's look at this from just one more angle, if you'll indulge me. When you build an interior, your interior, say, is in Chicago, right? It's in a neighborhood in Chicago. It's like an office space, and you're working on that project. You may think that the only people you have to care about are the people who are going to use that office space, right? And then maybe the neighbors, like in that neighborhood of Chicago, like, you don't want a space to be exclusive or cause disruption in the neighborhood, or, is not contributing to like economic inequity in the neighborhood. All of that is good. But everything that you put in that interior doesn't come from within that neighborhood. Right? It comes from sometimes all over the country, sometimes all over the world, right? Also, when somebody finally 10 years down the line tears out that interior and throws all that stuff away, all that stuff is not just staying in that neighborhood. It's going to landfills, who knows where. It's being sold for scrap, who knows where. We know that a lot of plastic scrap from the US ends up in India. Like, so we don't, like, every interior is a node within like an international network of people, right?
Yeah,
and
it totally is.
All of them, right? And so that's
and at whose health is that? At what expense are we enjoying, our beautiful interiors, right? Make wonderful interiors with the best looking finishes, and yes, no more VOCs and so forth. But at what expense can we have those?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, like, it's an open secret. Like, when all our offices shut down for COVID-19, like all of us, like, people who have desk jobs, we all got to go home, and then we all complained about, oh, my internet is not working and I have to be on Zoom now and all of this and all of that. Meanwhile, the offices that we left behind were being cleaned by cleaning crews even after we were gone. They were obviously working with each other. They have the same health risks as we did in that space, right? Like, but somehow it's okay for them to put their health at risk in maintaining that office space, when it was not okay for us to be at health risk sitting and working in that office space, right? Like, inequity is so visible and invisible at the same time. It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
And so, we really have to think about that. And I think COVID-19 really pointed out that, like, when it comes to health, health affects us all. And when some of us are unhealthy, none of us are safe, right? Like, I mean,
Mhm.
this is just true. Like, it's only to a certain extent that you can be like, okay, like, I don't care if like people are, unhealthy in some community somewhere else, as long as my family's fine. That's going to work for a while. It's not going to work forever, right? The moment
Mhm.
something like a pandemic happens, those frontline communities are affected, and what happens to them affects you in your, loft apartment, in the most expensive neighborhood in a city, right? So like, we are all connected. And so when we think about, this is why, you started by asking me, why is it complicated, with equity, and I think this is why it's complicated, right? It's a huge problem. And of course, health and equity are just so tied together. And I want to say, we are not the only people thinking of this. Plenty of organizations in the interiors and in the architecture space are working on this very problem right now. We're going to see
Mhm.
developments in standards, in ratings, in certifications, that focus on equity. We're also going to see product manufacturers start looking at their supply chains, not just from a health and climate point of view, but also from an equity point of view. And I think that movement is going to grow. One last thing on this is that EPDs and HPDs are not just good documents for climate and health, they're also good documents for equity. So for instance, when you talk about, air and water, EPDs
Mhm.
do consider that as part of the environmental impact of a product. So you could find out from an EPD what the impact is on air and water resources. It's just, we don't have a way right now of taking that information and then kind of adding it up. Like, we don't have a way of saying, okay, like my chair has this much impact, my table has this much impact, my flooring has this much impact. So what does that mean for my project as a whole?
Mhm.
We don't have a very clear way of doing that yet, I don't think. We can do it with health. I mean, there are great health ratings already, Fitwell, the well building standard. We understand that we can rate around health and well-being and, certify that, or like there's a certain, standard to that. All of those standards also have equity built into them, by the way, to some extent. So when you go for Fitwell rating, or when you go for, well certification, or you go for LEED certification, or you go for, living building challenge certification, those certifications do have all of them. Every single one of them has equity built into them in some.
Right.
It may not be the most comprehensive form, but it is there. So
Mhm.
it's not to say we haven't been looking at this problem. We have. It's just a big problem. And we're learning every day new ways of dealing with it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, we just have to continue to march on with this message. And, to me, this is not a checklist for certain people in the office. This is not a checklist for certain companies to practice in this way. These are, we have tools, as you have mentioned, the resources and other organizations, and we'll share their here so that, we continue to share the message, but it isn't a checklist, right? And slowly we're going to understand on how to make those connections. We're already starting to make those connections. As we practice day by day, we can see that, okay, the way I manufacture here, it affects this community's health, that community's health, and so forth. But it shouldn't be treated as a checklist. It should be wrapped up in everything that we do. What are some messages that you have? Like, can we leverage our design skills, as designers, or even like landlords who own large commercial portfolios? How can we bring this to the industry to design for our health? Ask this is because sometimes it's the sentiment is, I don't have time, I need to do it right now, and I just don't know enough about it. what are some of the messages that you have?
I would say my biggest message is start where, first of all, to really think deeply about what we have learned in the past couple of years dealing with the global pandemic. And also, within the US, some of the things we've certainly seen in the, when it comes to race, when it comes to economic inequity, these past 2 years have really taught us how much we are all connected, when it comes to health. Health is everything. If we have healthy communities, we don't have a healthy economy, we don't have a healthy country, we don't have, it affects us in so many ways. And like, if you paid attention to the news in any way, it's huge. And we know that like spaces, environments are a big determinant of health, right? We've said this over and over. I mean, if you haven't been to some of the resources that Fitwell and the International Well-Building Institute, I should say I've been involved with the International Well-Building Institute on their initiatives as well. So, I should certainly declare that. But they've put out so many resources that says, we are an indoor generation. For the first time ever, human beings spend more time indoors than outdoors. And this is very true even during the pandemic, even when we've done our best to go outdoors and spend time outside and so on. We are an indoor civilization at this point, right? And so what happens indoors affects our health, right? And so the first is, I think, to really be sensitized to this problem. The second thing I would say is start where you can. You don't have to have 100% of the answer 100% of the time. You start making a small difference wherever you can. And I think if all of us took it on ourselves to do that, we would have a huge collective impact, right? I mean, eventually policy will change. And policy, we can't, but the problem is we can't wait for policy to change. I mean, let's look at asbestos, for instance. We know that asbestos poisons people. We put it in all our buildings in the 50s and 60s. Then every company and every home spent, collectively millions of dollars taking the asbestos out because we know that it's bad for the environment. And then a few years ago, there was, some controversy around maybe making asbestos permissible again, when we know that it causes bad health impact. So now then we've reversed that policy. Like, policy is going to go back and forth, right? You have to follow the science, right? And I think that's also really important. It's like if you wait for the law to change, it's probably going to be too late. And so I would really urge you, wherever you can make a difference, please do so. For property owners in general, I think there are some great resources out there. The Carbon Leadership Forum has a toolkit for owners, okay? So if you're a property owner, I urge you to go to the Carbon Leadership Forum and just take a look at that toolkit. If you are a designer, please make your clients aware of that toolkit, right? It really helps understand what are the economic impacts, what are the business bottom line impacts, what are the, social impacts of ignoring the climate crisis. So in your building property. So for property owners, there are resources available. For designers, we've created at Metropolis, we helped create the climate toolkit for interior design. It's available on our website. It's super easy. It's free, open to all. Please take a look at it because it has certain common sense things that you can start doing today to make a good impact with your material choices. That's like a big piece of that. And then, so I would say first, sensitize yourself, reflect on the lessons of the last 2 years. Second, start where you can, use the resources that are available. The third thing I just want to remind everyone, especially who are designers, who might be listening, or who you're connected with, that the average designer, even a designer who works within a medium-sized or a small firm, most interior design firms in our country are small to medium firms, right? We're not
Mhm.
in an office, we're more like 10, 20, 3 people in an office, right? But even as a designer within that firm, your purchasing power, just through the specification decisions you make in a year, is 26 times that of the average consumer. So if we, in a capitalist society, if we talk about consumers having power to influence the world through the choices that they make on what they choose to buy and what they choose not to buy, as an interior designer, you have 26 times that power. If you happen to work at a large firm, like one of the top 20 firms in this country, you have 100 times the purchasing power of an average consumer. So you have the ability to make a huge difference. Now, I know that those purchases are not, you don't solely control those purchases. Your clients have a say, so many people have a say.
Mhm.
But if you can move your specification decisions to a responsible place for interiors, you can have a huge multiplying impact. And so I think that's my last message to anyone who's listening here is, there's a lot you can do with just the power that's in your hands.
Okay, I lost you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you. No, you are making excellent, excellent points. I mean, as far as, as soon as you said, we've been talking about health, but the economic impact, and we have to be honest here, we have to follow the money, right? And that's what really, drives a lot of the decisions. How much is this going to cost me? That's being realistic. But if we can connect that to the positive impacts we can have on economics with health, that's yet another win. And I'm so glad that you brought it up, and the purchasing power is huge as well. It's just aligning that, connecting economics to the decisions that we make is huge. And it's positive. It's a positive impact. Wouldn't you agree? I know you do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a positive impact. Any little thing we do can have a positive impact. I mean, the potential for us to move things in the right direction is huge. I don't see all of this as some, giant unsurmountable problem. I see it as opportunity, right? And I think designers who equip themselves with the skills and with the mindset of really designing interiors that will do good in the world are the designers whose work will stand the test of time and who are better prepared for the future of the profession, for the future challenges the profession is going to face. I mean, if you are producing work that you are consistently able to stand by and your spaces deliver great results for not just your clients, but for the end users, for communities, for the world, I mean, that is the way to success, right? And so even if you're, motivated just by professional development, invest in, the skills in this space, in learning the tools and frameworks here, because it really can open up doors for you. There's so much opportunity out there. The number of companies in the world right now that have made a commitment to net zero carbon, when in 2019, it was maybe 500 companies in the world. Today, it stands closer to 1,000, right? There's huge change happening. And so, thinking about the impact of interiors in creating healthy spaces for people, especially after we've been through one of the worst health crises of our generation, I think it's a very smart investment in your own future as well.
Yes, and that's so, I couldn't agree with you more. Our conversation could continue, but I know that you have to go soon. You're going to continue doing wonderful things. But for those of you watching, please follow Metropolis Magazine and the work that Avi is doing there, and the features that they have, because it's really useful resources. And there are built projects that are doing this right now. So that's really what the point of these talks are. Designing healthy environments is to share the resources and to share what is happening, what can be done, and for you to join in. Quite simply, join in.
Yeah. Just a quick note. I mean, of course, I've said it a couple of times. Our website is metropolismag.com. We're Metropolis Mag, METROPOLISMAG, on almost all social media. So follow us. I also host a podcast called Deep Green. I urge you to follow that as well. We release episodes every 2 weeks. We're launching the new season of Deep Green the 1st of March. So by the time you hear this, you should be able to start to access that. It's out in just a couple of weeks, and so we follow those topics as well. So like whether you like to read it, listen to it, watch it, we have resources for you. So yes, thank you so much, Alicia, for this platform, for talking to me today about this. It's something that obviously we care about a lot, and we cover this topic time and again at Metropolis. We're trying to build new resources. So I hope all of you will stay engaged with us.
We definitely will, and we will be following Deep Green and sharing that information as well. I want to say thank you and congratulations on everything that you're doing. Just keep it up, and we'll be following you. Thank you, Avi.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Same here. Have a healthy day. Thank you.